Good morning. Coming to you with this question that I've been pondering with myself in my own life and relationships, in thinking about others, our understanding of things like mental health. And I'm really curious about this use of labels that we get. I'm primarily talking about the labels that we get from the world of psychology, and wanting to honor when those labels can be helpful, whether it's a label on our current levels and experience of our mental health and or mood, and whether or not it's something that's been with us for as long as you can remember, or something that we're just moving through. And this already starts to bring up some of my questions about this use of labels. Labels like bipolar disorder, right? Labels like any sort of personality disorder, for instance, which could include things like narcissism, right? Borderline personality as a description, various mood disorders, and then also things that describe how our mind works, right? Whether it's talking about whether we're on the spectrum of sorts, whether we are feeling or described as more like neurotypical or atypical, right? I think those are some of the terms as I try to stay current. Also things with how we use our attention, right? Whether we might call ourselves ADD or hyperactive as far as use of energy, or just different experiences like anxiety and depression, right? So when we look at these experiences and, yes, want to honor that it's been helpful for us from the world of psychology to learn more about what these different experiences, types of, or ways a personality might express itself, right? How it can be helpful to understand more that we could use these labels to describe what we're seeing, and especially if we're trying to help that person, right? And so I want to honor if it's been helpful to you or anyone you love to get a label, whether someone else gave you a label or a diagnosis, or whether you've just kind of self-diagnosed, that you have various ways that you can be or behave or experience life, right, that may fall under one of those labels. So I want to honor if that's been helpful. And I do come from the world of psychology, going to graduate school, studying things like how we learn, how we grow, how we develop, and even things like theories of counseling. So along my journey, I got to hear more and learn more about these labels and things like that diagnostic manual that gives us those labels. But one of the things I appreciate that happened along my journey was one of the last classes I had in my graduate school training in psychology, before I got into things like yoga and meditation, really, and spirituality and consciousness, which when we start to bring in those aspects, we also start to see some of what might trouble us about the use of labels, right? If we're also interested in transformation and what's possible with being human, right? And what we can shift, what we can change, what we can lift, what we can improve for ourselves, and when we're holding space for others, right? So, but yeah, I remember that towards the end of my graduate school that one of my classes was taught by this Native American professor. I wish I remember his name. I think it was Cervantes was his last name. But I remember that he really helped us see that when we go back to more ancient cultures and we realize that this psychology approach, Western psychology, we're really talking about, which includes a lot of, especially nowadays, way more than 25 years ago when I went to graduate school. Can't believe it's been that long. But way more than ever, we're using those labels, right? And a lot of us now know what they are. are kind of like low pro psychology experts, right? And so we're labeling everyone around us as, whether, we call them a narcissist, or whether we're labeling ourselves, right? And then getting help or not. And then, yeah, the world of medicine, a lot, because of like things like the insurance companies too, right? They kind of require practitioners to place a label or a diagnosis on someone to prescribe a medicine. So that's interesting too. So anyways, more than ever, we're using these labels. But remember, this is kind of a new thing that came from Western psychology. And that when you go back to more native times, more tribal days, which we humans have been more of the time than these recent, what has it been, like 50, 100 years that we've had, influences like Freud and on, right? And giving us things like these labels and what we can do in mental health, right? But yeah, back in the ancient times, the tribal days, the native ways, when we looked at things like mental health and how the tribes and how even the medicine people of the tribe, which sometimes was even like a shaman, right, or shaman, I'm not ever sure how to say that word right, but they weren't using labels when they would look to help a person. That they were maybe understanding more that there's just such a variety amongst humans, and that it's not always as clear as it seems, and often it's more like psycho-spiritual things going on for that person, have to do with why they're exhibiting that current behavior or that level of expression, right? Or that type of personality even. And just approaching it that way, in a more of a awe-inspired, open approach of just embracing the variety of human experience. So just interesting to consider that we haven't always had these labels. Now more than ever, we're using them, right? But again, I want to honor if that's been helpful for you or anyone you know to receive a label, and how that's helped you, whatever you've done with that, right? As far as getting support and continuing to support yourself. And I'm all for that. But I'm also feeling very aware of how those labels could really limit us, both with our personal growth and possibility, with how we can be, how we can live, how we can envision our future, even, right, and create for ourselves, and definitely our possibilities with relationships of all sorts, right? And again, hopefully sometimes it's helpful in our personal growth and in our relationships to get a label so that we can adapt to that possible truth about that person or ourselves, right? Like, if this is someone who could be called, or for someone, if we fall under some labels, which might mean that we have different levels of sensitivity, or different ways our brain works, right? Or different levels of attention and ways we experience emotion and express that. If there are some truths to, if it is a real inherent part of our nature, right? That yes, what can we do to embrace that, work with that, honor that in ourselves and others, in our relationships, whether it's our romantic relationships, right? Whether it's our relationships with our kids, our family members, our coworkers, right? So thankful for when those labels help us understand ourselves and others, and even get the support we need and make the changes. But really concerned about when those labels become a life sentence for us, or how we're looking at someone else, in that we've just taken on that label in a way that's not empowering us, right? That may be limiting us in our own possibility, in our own perceptions of ourselves and what's possible for us, right? And definitely maybe limiting our relationships and how much we're ready to connect with others, and what if we're having a hard time connecting with others, or I'm just curious about how much it might be because we're using these labels sometimes in such a way that I don't think it was ever intended to be, whether it means kind of self-diagnosing or giving a label to someone else because their behavior might match one of those labels, right? And this is where we need to remember that even if our behavior or someone else's behavior matches one of those labels, it never was meant to be a life sentence, right? A lot of those labels, those mood disorders, quote unquote, those personality disorders, quote unquote, don't have to be a life sentence, right? Especially if we're someone who is into things like consciousness, what's possible, what's changeable, that it's all energy, right? That it has a lot to do with even stored trauma, ancestral trauma. You know, a lot of these patterns and ways of being are often responses to trauma in our lives or from even generations before, and conditioning, right? And ways that we've been repressed and are not maybe letting ourselves be our full selves. And then how much does it have to do with our relationship with our creative flow and our creativity and even our spiritual connection, right? And then that's where, again, we really want to watch if we're wanting to be spiritual. And this is my biggest why in all of this. And this might be towards the end of what I'm going to say here. But if we want to be spiritual, right? And if we really do believe that, for instance, we're all children of God or the universe, right? And so that means, like one of my teachers says, Eric Schiffman said, reminds us we could be always looking out and just being like, oh yeah, brother, sister, like really remembering that namaste awareness, which we can see that a lot of our practices, especially yoga, if you call yourself a yogi, yoga union is supposed to be all about that, really reconnecting with that awareness of that God within us and others, and that truth maybe that we're all this energy, this magic, right? And even so then, when we look at the use of labels with ourselves and others, especially when we're making it a life sentence, it really doesn't make sense, right? Like that if we're going to put ourselves or someone else in a box under a label, and whether that means we limit ourselves with what we think we can do and how we feel about ourselves because we've taken on that label and made it a life sentence that's limiting us, or whether we're putting that label on someone else and just deciding that's who they are and pushing them away, maybe shutting down, and then wondering why we're lonely and alone. Perhaps, like how much might that have to do with how we're labeling others and judging others and forgetting about that whole spiritual aspect again, right? And not that every relationship is meant to be, perhaps, or functional for either party, but I just think that we need to look at how our labels of ourselves and others may be really limiting our connection, right? And our relationships and our personal growth. And to just remember, it was never really meant to be a life sentence. A lot of these labels just meant to be more of a current description of a current level of functioning, right? And that's where, and we can just even get into specifics of how we can be more empowered in that, even how we think about it, how we talk about it, to not own that as a life sentence unless we want to, if that helps you, great. If that makes you feel more powerful, more alive, more connected, more compassionate, to be in that label or to put that on someone else, if it helps you be more compassionate with them, right? And maybe even more ready to connect with them because you now can see them through that lens that helps you, helps them, beautiful, right? But if it's our reason for disconnecting, for being even hateful or angry or judging, right? Or limiting ourselves, our relationships, and what we even see as possible with ourselves and our relationships and others, then yeah, I just am not sure that that's where this was ever meant to go with the use of modern Western psychology. And I think we just need to be aware that we're in a current culture where it's become very mainstream, and a lot of us think we're low pro psychology experts. But if you do, if you're one of those and you're out there labeling people, including yourself, just remember, yeah, it was never meant to be a life sentence. We want to look at how it's limiting ourselves, and it's also kind of a curse sometimes too, that if you're getting a label, it's like your word is your wand. And especially, yeah, if you don't see it as maybe just a description of a current level of functioning and expression, and if you really want to buy into or get into, like, maybe everything's changeable and possible, it's all energy. And if we're all those children of God, if we're all made of that God energy, then that might really shift how we're going to talk about and think about things like these labels with ourselves and others. And yeah, I'm interested in exploring that in my life, in relationships, and my experience with myself and others. And yeah, letting my consciousness evolve, and even my relationships be a place where I'm trying something new and different, and really being in that spiritual perspective more than ever, and more than anything, right? And how much that's going to set the foundation for what's possible and what we experience, right? So thankful to share with you. Thanks for listening if you're still with me. And let me know what you think about labels and our use of them, right? Is it helping you? Is it hindering you? Is it harmful in your relationships? Is it enhancing things? Let me know. I'm so curious about this and wanting to explore and expand, just so that more of us can, right, enjoy our lives, feel connected, have fulfilling relationships in all sorts, right, and just enjoy this precious life. So hope that's helpful to you on this Sunday morning. Sending you love out there. Namaste.